Carcass was the first Goregrind band ever, and if imitation is the most sincere form of flattery, then they're one of the most impressive bands of their time. Their existence has spawned a lot of bands that play their style of music. These Carcass clones, or Carcass worship bands as they're called, play the style of Carcass's first two albums to a T, or they add their own musical ideas to the mix. However, there is a common misconception that all Goregrind bands are Carcass clones, and sometimes this isn't the case. Before I listened to these bands that I needed to discuss, I listened to the first 3 Carcass albums to compare their work. Reek of Putrefaction is the textbook definition of Goregrind. It has some of the worst production I've ever heard on any album, but it's fun, ridiculous, and has that low-budget horror movie quality that's hard to match. There are all kinds of pitch-shifted and raspy vocals with that distinct squealing guitar sound. It gives this album a distinct atmosphere that's full of slime and chaos. Not to mention, the lyrics are full of medical terminologies. As opposed to the zombie lyrics that was being played in metal a lot at the time, the medical terminologies were designed to make the gore seem more realistic. This atmosphere and the lyrics are what draws the line between regular grindcore and goregrind for me. Now, Symphonies of Sickness, it's a goregrind album by Spirit, but it has more death metal song structures. The songs are longer, the tempos are slower, and there's less of that punky grind influence that Reek of Putrefaction had. But the atmosphere and the rumbling guitars are still there. Necroticism moved further away from grindcore and was more of a point-blank death metal album. However, this album contained a lot of samples featuring psychotic doctors and surgeons. This kept the goregrind spirit retained. Samples would be used more often with more contemporary goregrind bands from here on out. With each album, it showed that not only could Carcass evolve, but the genre with it. Each Carcass album became more sophisticated, and meanwhile, a lot of bands came into existence that were heavily influenced by these 3 albums. A lot of Goregrind fans prefer listening to other Goregrind bands as opposed to the first couple Carcass albums. The reasons are often cited as the lack of good production on these albums, or that the other bands are sicker and nastier, or that these albums might be seen as boring. It has to be remembered though that this style of music was young, as were Carcass at the time, so the music hasn't evolved yet, and the direction that grindcore was going to go wasn't exactly established. So that's the historical significance, but the question still remains, why listen to a clone instead of the original? Why listen to Black Sabbath worship bands when you could just listen to Black Sabbath? Well, maybe these bands can achieve something that the originals couldn't. For example, Sleep's Holy Mountain. It's a lot heavier and trippier than anything on Masters of Reality. Similar to Goregrind, Haemorrhage's Morgue Sweet Home has more variety, better production, and more punk elements than either of the first 2 Carcass albums. It doesn't necessarily take any justice away from the originals though, because if these bands like the source material enough to make their own contributions, add their own ideas and improvements, then it's some form of tribute. A lot of the bands that tribute Reek of Putrefaction make the music have the same riffs and the same vocal styles, even going as far as to have awful production to boot. However, the sound of Reek is a one-off thing. Never since has a band been able to get an album to sound quite that horrible. However, the production is also a point of criticism on certain sides of the autopsy table. Some gore fans say that while this album's production may have made for an intimidating atmosphere at the time, it hasn't really aged well because the production overpowers the band, to the point where it's hard to decipher what the band is playing. Even contemporary goregrind bands with horrible production made it so that way you could hear what the band is playing. But this can also be a reason for Carcass clones to have a place in the morgue, because Carcass strayed further away from grindcore and goregrind throughout their career, and the only point-blank goregrind album was Reek of Putrefaction. If a band were able to take that musical style from this album and make it listenable, then it would do the service of keeping an obscure sound alive and recognizable. These goregrind bands, they seem to have different goals. Some exist solely to recreate the sound of the first couple Carcass albums. An example of this would be General Surgery. With General Surgery, the vocals, guitar tunings, song titles, and even the Napalm Death influence were pretty much the same as Carcass. However, the production is a lot better, so it's much easier to listen to than either of these albums. The county medical examiners are the exact same way, but the county medical examiners are actual doctors, with one of the members being in their 60s. It can be assured that the band knows what they're talking about lyrically, but they're also self-aware in the fact that they exist for the sole purpose of recreating the early Carcass sound. There's no originality and they don't claim to have any. But it's nice to hear a faithful continuance of the first couple albums. Pathologists from the Czech Republic are the same way, except these guys actually use a lot of B-movie samples and there are no high-pitched vocals. This makes everything sound nastier. See, when listening to Goregrind, the vocals tend to bring different impacts to the overall sound. But there are also bands that are more influenced by other grind bands than Carcass. Xysma is one of the first Carcass clones. Their first demo and first EP were bleaker and more repugnant than either of the first two Carcass albums. However, the sound is more reminiscent of Napalm Death and Repulsion more than Carcass. You also have Gruesome Stuff Relish, who also have the Carcass sound, but they use a lot of B-movie samples. They're highly campy. The band isn't around to be innovative, but they're having the time of their lives. I mean, they use a lot of synths, organs, and humor in their music. So maybe the band is more influenced by Impetigo. But we also can't forget Last Days of Humanity. They don't really sound like Carcass. I mean, they still use the distorted bass, but the riffing and the musicianship is somehow more technical as there are more slow, groovier sections in their songs. I actually detect a bit of a Suffocation and Obituary influence in their music sometimes with the slower parts. And as for the faster parts, I'm hearing a little bit of Terrorizer. It's a really cool band. There aren't any high-pitched vocals, but the guy sounds like a prehistoric creature. Then there are bands with twists to the gore sound. Machetazo to me is an example of this. Now, if you want straight up Goregrind from this band, check out their split with Abscess and you'll get a DeLorean full of deadites. However, they're actually a mix of Goregrind, power violence, and grindcore. Which side of them you hear really depends on which album and song you listen to, but sometimes they like to mix it up a bit. Squash Bowels from Poland. They do a great surgical extraction with more screamy vocals instead of Jeff Walker's rasps. I was actually a bit surprised when I heard the Tenorival album, because there are a lot of industrial and electronic sounds in there. A bit abrasive, but if you wanted variety, there you go. Their other albums are more technical and brutal, but they're hard-hitting nonetheless. But gore-themed lyrics in grindcore doesn't always make it Goregrind. An example of this would be Inhume from Poland. The band considers their music to be more death grind. Similarly, Repulsion is pretty influential for their gory lyrics. But the term Goregrind was first coined by Carcass, and Repulsion always saw themselves as grindcore. I mean, you should listen to Repulsion anyway, no matter what category they are, but it's important to know the distinction. For instance, Napalm Death may have lyrics about torturing somebody, but it's not Goregrind because A, it's not as graphic as some of these Goregrind bands get, and B, because Napalm Death doesn't have the atmosphere that these bands have. Goregrind at heart seems to have this atmosphere of dirty, slimy, disgusting carnage. It's just like Impetigo. They're not your typical Goregrind band because their sound is often more death grind. However, it's the splatter lyrics, the samples, and the vocals that make all the difference. Their Hialo demo and their debut album have this distinct low-fidelity quality and the vibe of a Lucio Fulci movie. Just read the lyrics, and you'll understand why Impetigo are considered gods of gore. Now, I've talked about enough Carcass-influenced bands, but now it's time to discuss bands with their own sound. Sweden's hellhounds, known as Regurgitate. They have their own original brand of Godzilla combat. Obviously, there's still some Carcass influences as well as from other bands, but you gotta remember, no band can start from scratch. I mean, every band's gonna have some influences. See, Regurgitate is good for their D-beats, their lightning speed, their brutality, and the riffs are a lot like Entombed. They take their influences from all over the place. And lyrically, I think that this band makes Carcass look PG-13. Definitely worth checking out. And there's a newer band called Anatomist. They hail from Argentina. Brilliant example of newer generation grindcore and Goregrind, but think of that feeling that you get when listening to Urine Junkies by Abscess. His voice is nasty, but there are plenty of punk elements to be heard. Filthy, fun, and original. And then there's Haemorrhage, yeah! Their first album, Medic Cult, sounded a bit like Carcass, but hearing comparisons like this hurt the band because they were influenced more by other bands than Carcass, plus they wanted to prove that they had their own identity. So with albums like Groom and Anatomical Inferno, they proved that they had their own identity. Personally, I hear a lot of Terrorizer influences. Instead of the albums being blast beats the whole way through, they have a lot of punk beats and slower, groovier elements, like on the song Rectovaginal Fistula. Listen to the song. Carcass never did a song like that. Besides, what's cooler than a band that has its own mascot? Meanwhile, Carnal Diafragma is filthy porno gore that doesn't just focus on being sick, but they focus on being brutal as well. It's groove-oriented and it takes a lot of great lessons from 90s grindcore. Another favorite, Dead Infection. Gore to the max. Interesting riffs and has more of a grind and death grind feel to it. Instead of the lyrics being medical, the songs all tell a story, making the vibe sometimes more comic horror. Plus, those vocals are deep, really pummeling sound. So not all gore grind bands are Carcass clones. Even if some of these bands are heavily influenced by Carcass, most of them still take influence from other grindcore bands. If they do rip off Carcass, then they still serve the purpose of making Reek of Putrefaction sound listenable. On the other side of that, the bands that are making their own sound and creating their own influences and adding more variety to the music is going to show that the genre is still evolving. Maybe it's not quite as fast as black metal's evolution, but still. Filthy and destructive, just like Goregrind should be. Thank you for watching.